Hey folks, welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is episode 122, holiday edition. If you're listening current week of the release, it is Christmas for those of you who celebrate it. I believe it's also Hanukkah this week. So happy holidays. And for this week's show, I want to just take a moment and thank this week's show sponsor. This week's episode brought to you by Podbean, podcast hosting and monetization. Easiest way to start podcasting if you go to podbean.com/TPD. Through the end of 2016, they're offering 30% off their annual plans. And after the first of the year, that special URL will get you your first month for free. I'll tell you more about Podbean in just a little while. This week's show is also brought to you by our wonderful Patreon supporters, the few, the proud, the awesome. I've had a couple more sign up in recent weeks, and I thank you guys all very much for joining the Patreon campaign for the Podcast Digest. It means a lot to me when one of you take a moment as little as $1 a month and sign on, and really helps the show out, and it means a huge amount to me that people are taking the time to do that. I want to thank personally our very most recent Patreon supporter, Rebecca Pope, hopped on. So Rebecca, thank you very much for joining the Patreon campaign. If you're interested in supporting the show, link in the show notes, folks, for the Podcast Digest on Patreon. Let's get to this week's show. This is a big one, folks. I've been really anxious to release this one to you. My guest this week, as you already know from the title of this week's episode, is Wendy Zukerman from Science Versus and Gimlet Media. Wendy is awesome. Truly one of the great people in podcasting, and the personality you hear on Science Versus is exactly what I had the privilege to talk to, and the conversation that is coming forth. She's got a great tale, a great story of her life in the podcast space, literally moving from one continent to another to make the awesome Science Versus show. I think that you will like this conversation. So without further ado, I don't want to hold this up any longer. Let's get to this week's episode, my conversation with Wendy Zukerman. And folks, welcome back to the Podcast Digest. As I mentioned up front, it's my privilege to welcome to the show for the first time ever somebody I've been a big fan of ever since her season 1, and there's so much to talk about in her story of her show. I have as my guest this week the creator and host of Science Versus from Gimlet Media, Wendy Zukerman. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me. It's a real honor to talk to you. I've really been a big fan of your work for ever since the beginning. But before we jump into the show and this crazy road you've traveled with it, I want folks to get to know a little bit about you personally. So can you tell folks a little bit about your background in science or prior to the audio component? Who's Wendy?
Who's Wendy? Okay, I guess I'm going to say that's such a complex question, but it's really not. I'm really not that complicated. I was born in LA, but our family moved to Australia when I was 6 months old, which I only say because we have a podcast for next season on immigration coming up. And I feel like the fact that I was born in America and am an American will suddenly become relevant. But I do couch myself as Australian. I lived there all my life. And let's see, when did I, you know what, when I love telling science stories, and I love being a science journo or journalist, but it wasn't always the way. And I studied law at uni, law and biomedical science, and always wanted to be a journalist, and always kind of wanted to be like everyone else, a war correspondent or a political journo, because that seemed kind of sexy at the time. But I thought that was so impossible and so competitive, so I kind of studied law, which I kind of loved as I started really getting into, but then quickly realized I didn't want to be a lawyer, and also quickly realized that reporting on politics and war was not half as exciting and as intriguing for me as reporting on science, and I kind of quickly fell in love with this world that actually at university was never, to me, science at uni was very much like, this is how a kidney works, memorize it and then get a good grade in school. And then once I started actually doing journalism in this space and realized that, there's all these unknowns and all these exciting things to learn, and it really sparked this curiosity inside me that I didn't have when I was just thinking about politics and things like that. Which is not to say that politics can't be full of curiosity and childlike excitement, but not for me. So very quickly I realized this was my path, and I was supposed to, when I finished university, I was supposed to go to this very fancy corporate law firm, but I took a year off instead and started writing science articles, and then by the end of the year got a job at New Scientist magazine, and then became their Asia Pacific correspondent for a little bit, and I guess the story, as they say, what did they say? What did they say about that?
That's how it all began.
That's how it all began.
I'll go with that. And not long after that, if my research and preparation for today has led me the right road, radio and television in terms of that science reporting came not long after. A quick YouTube search, and I found a couple of Channel 10 spots, yes?
Yeah, that's right. So New Scientist was absolutely wonderful. But then I switched I started working for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which brought me onto television, initially doing research and a couple of spots on TV as the face. And then I moved into radio and then switched back TV, radio kind of. And then I was asked to make this podcast. And then that is where this trajectory began. So radio for me, now that I'm in America and I see all these people who have spent, in some cases, decades, but definitely their whole career in love with audio, and it means so much to them. I just see myself as this lucky little Cinderella that was like, how did I end up here? I'm a print journalist. I don't. So it's all very exciting and very new, and yeah, I feel very, very lucky to be here.
Probably everybody who's listening to this, and if not, folks, I don't know what you're doing, has heard an episode of Science Versus. And one of the things you do, of course, is to try to pull out the facts, or as long as those facts exist, and kind of get to the truth of everything. I mentioned the Channel 10 spots on YouTube because there's one in particular that almost look like a seed planted in your mind in terms of what Science Versus ultimately became, and that was the one on Google, and that you called, that people sometimes think it's the oracle of truth, and that Google results and finding facts there can so often be misleading. And I'm kind of curious, you mentioned science and journalism, and that spot made me think, was exploring science is one thing, but kind of pulling the facts out of it seems like a unique angle to take. Kind of where did that idea sort of start to gestate in your mind?
I think I always loved finding the facts in things. That was always what was most interesting about science for me. I did love the discoveries because they just put a smile on your face in it, to think how the world works, and how, every now and then there's this animal study that comes out that's like, wow, these little creatures, whether it's ants and how they communicate, or, birds and how they fly these distances and know where they're going. And you just think, oh, wow, that's such a lovely image. I'm so glad I had that little moment to think about that and not think about my daily life struggles, which are not that horrendous at all. But just daily life boredom. But yet to spend my life being able to tell people that perhaps the things they think out of just intuition or just their emotions, or maybe someone had told them something when they were young and it just stuck, and to be able to talk to them about that and say, where is the evidence behind what you're thinking? It's not there, or it is there. So at university, for example, I started the science. There was like a university publication, ours was called Lot's Wife, and I started the science section. And most of that was just sort of busting myths, whether it was about diets, or whether it was about why when you smoke pot you get the munchies, or whether it was just like explaining and questioning people's ideas about the world. So I think I always just found that really fascinating and really fun.
So at the Australian Broadcasting Company, ABC, commonly referred to as, was that sort of where did the idea of Science Versus come from? Was this something that you wanted to do to try a different medium, or did they approach you and say, hey, we'd like the podcast on this topic? What was the origin story?
I had been, at this point at the ABC, I'd been there for a couple of years, and I was doing research for a science television show called Catalyst, and at the same time was starting to do bits of television. Just whenever a big news discovery came out in science, then there would be various go-tos that they would go to. And at one point, kind of, I started to be in that pool of interest, whether it was for various television and mainly radio shows. So they'd kind of, around the ABC, I sort of became known as someone who could talk about science and talk about it with interest and excitement. And then when the ABC started to get into podcasting, this is kind of a new idea. They podcast all their radio shows, kind of like CBC and NPR and this sort of thing. But this was the first time that they were actually going to make something that would not go out on the radio, that would just be for digital. So it was very exciting, but also something that had been done in America and Canada for some time. And the people who were running that operation, currently head by my now senior producer, Caitlin Sori, had done an analysis and found out that science podcasts tend to do very well in Australia. And they knew that I was interested and excited by science. And so Caitlin came up to me and said, what have you got? You got something interesting? Do you want to make a science podcast for us? Pitch me something. And around the same time, there was a report in the news that Gwyneth Paltrow had suggested that women steam clean their vaginas. And that kind of was a nice hotbed of, distracted people for about 5 minutes as they were enraged by this concept, which they should have been. And it just got me thinking, and I thought, Science versus Gwyneth Paltrow. And that was my initial pitch. And it was this idea of doing a podcast that looked at these things that people were saying you should do, you must do, you have to do, and actually questioning whether there was any science behind it. And the plan was always to do this in a fun and non-lecture-y series kind of way. So to kind of marry the fact that I love comedy with the fact that I love facts. So that was kind of how it all started. So I made this pitch and I gave it to Caitlin and she loved it and she got me to do a pilot and then we were off and away. And that was kind of all it was.
That's got to be the greatest origin story I've heard in these 120 plus episodes I've done, in terms of Gwyneth Paltrow and her crazy statements, causing the. Have you ever? I'd almost want to reach out to her at some point and say, "Hey, look, do you listen to this show? Because you are part inspiration of it."
Yeah, I have a lot to thank Gwyneth Paltrow for. Not just sliding doors now, just my second career.
So the first season is up and running at ABC, and it was a somewhat different show than what listeners are hearing today with Gimlet Media. And from what I understand, one of the reasons is that back then in Australia, you were shouldering a lot of the effort back then. This was you had less resources, if you will. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So at the time, I mean, the ABC and I had no idea what I was getting into. I mean, because like many public broadcasters, it's just run, particularly the radio department and the TV department really, it's just run on a shoestring budget when you compare it to the resources here in America. And so I was pretty much making the show on my own. And then I had Caitlin Sori as my editor and producer. And so she at the same time was producing 3 podcasts, including Science Versus. So I would grab her time whenever I could. So I probably had her maybe 1.5, 2 days a week. And then the rest, it was just me making it. And we just had no idea what we were doing. I mean, I also had another job, so I only really had 3 days to make it. And then I had to pay the bills effectively on another job that was 2 to 3 days a week. But it just, as the audience grew and the demand grew and the interest grew and my confidence grew, it just sucked up everything into this. My life was a Science Versus vortex, which I was not expecting when I wrote that initial pitch about Gwyneth Paltrow.
It certainly seemed to be a huge hit. I mean, I think I found out about it 2 or 3 episodes into that first season because as I was launching my show and starting everything up here, I was following everybody in the podcast space I could and kept finding so many people talking about it. And I hopped on and just like so many other people, really loved what I heard. From your perspective, though, Wendy, why do you think it did so well? Was it the topics? Was it the length? Was it you? Do you think, or some combination thereof?
Oh, I wonder. I mean, I really do, because it's so. I mean, you've got to imagine it. Just someone working with a mic and a little bit of editing software in the dark, effectively. I mean, we did have electricity, but, coming in on the weekends in the dark, just working on this little thing on her own. And then all of a sudden it gets in the charts in the United States. I mean, it was like, what? Like, it was up there with, 99% Invisible and This American Life. I mean, it was up there with those guys. And I was like, what is going on? And I mean, I know that at the second episode, I kind of rolled out of bed on a Saturday morning and checked my phone, and my Twitter was going a little crazier than usual because no one was really following me at the time, so it was like unusual. And then I tracked it back and found out that Roman Mars had sent out a tweet saying, "You've got to listen to this new podcast called Science Versus. You'll love it." And so that was, it was already doing quite well in terms of Australian standards in EP 1 and EP 2. But then once Roman Mars tweeted it, you saw this kind of tick up and up and up. And then, so, I think that absolutely helped. I think people also liked the topics. I think they did like the length. I don't know. I get, my hope is that they just wanted to know what the facts were about the topics we were covering. And so they kept listening to find out about the science.
So this was wholly and completely a surprise to you in terms of how well it's performed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had zero expectations. I had no idea that this would be the future, my future for the next couple of years. I signed I didn't even sign anything. Like, it was that informal. It was just like, all right, go make 10 episodes. And so in my mind, I was like, all right, I'll make 10 episodes. This is 3 months of my life. And then I'll just go back to kind of doing what I was doing. Like, nothing in my head had thought this is going to take me to New York, let alone that I would still be making it when I started. I think it's so wonderful when I think about how naive we were. It's so great, and what low expectations we had, and to have them. It's rare in life as an adult that you have where you just don't think about the future and you just go and do something and then it takes off. It's often you just keep putting more and more expectations on yourself and then getting a little bit disappointed even if you do well. But this was one of those examples where you just go and do it, and then it does well.
So I'm sure a lot of people, the question everyone right now wants me to ask you, and so I'll put it out there, is how does Wendy Zukerman and Science Versus end up in New York?
Right. So after season 1 finished, I got an email from Gimlet Media, who I think it's now known around the office, maybe not, that I didn't know what Gimlet Media was. And at the time, I had heard that episode of Startup that aired on This American Life. This is how outside of the podcast world I was. I was very much embedded in the science journalism world in Australia, I guess. But so I got this email, and at the time I was getting, every now and then I would get these lovely emails from people just saying, I really love the show, which is a very new experience for me. And so it was lovely. And so when the season ended, I was super exhausted. I was trying not to check my emails that often. And so I got this email there was another one. It was just like, thank you. We really like what you're doing. It's really great. Anyway, we're from Gimlet Media. Maybe you should give us a call. And so I didn't really think much of it. And then I think I even left it for a day. And then something in my mind went, I had that email I've got to reply to. And then looked up who Gimlet Media were. And I remember I was doing it in the office. And my whole heart was just like, oh, what? Like, it was just like, oh, okay. Wrote back immediately. Was not trying to play anything cool. Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yep, free anytime. Let me know. And so eventually we worked out a time to chat. And at the time it was just a super relaxed conversation on Skype about what they're doing, what I'm doing. I happened to mention just casually that I own the concept of Science Versus, happened to mention casually I'm an American citizen. But nothing, there was no mention of bringing Science Versus over to Gimlet Media. And then a week later got an email that just said, we're interested. Would you consider it? And even then, I don't think I fully took it seriously or knew. It was just too bizarre. It was just all too bizarre. And then, so a week later, I was Skyping with Matt and Alex, the company's founders, and Caitlin Kenny, head of new development. And again, it was so relaxed. I was telling Alex recently that because the timing in Australia and America is such, it was quite a late, I think it was like a midnight Skype session. And a really good friend of mine was leaving town, and so we'd had a couple of drinks beforehand and then came back and had this Skype chat. I mean, it was all so unbelievable. And then, long story short, you can't say no to that opportunity. When it all became real that this was really happening and a contract was sent over to say, will you come here? I signed along the dotted line and ultimately took a plane trip.
Was it difficult in any way? I mean, clearly you had your relationship with ABC. I imagine you had a group of family and friends still in Australia. Was there any hesitancy or difficulty in making the choice?
Yeah, there was. I mean, I'm not an incredibly ambitious person. I mean, coming to New York, I'm not at all.
That's pretty ambitious.
Yeah, calibrated that completely. I always have ambitions for myself, but I never had this. There's a lot of Australians who really want to make it in New York. You know, there's a lot of people in the world who really want to make it in New York. I wasn't one of those people. But at the same time, you have this opportunity. And a lot of it was I just didn't want to be the sort of person that would say no. Like I was scared to come to this new place where I didn't really know anyone, and I had this beautiful life at home. But you don't want to be the person that says no to that. And I was talking to my dad about it and saying, I don't know, my family's here and everything, and, there's so much uncertainty if I go. I've kind of made a name for myself in Australia. I don't know what's going to happen over there. My dad was like, what are you, an old woman? Just go. and I remember that. And I was like, of course. So it was tough, but only to a certain point that when Alex Bloomberg says, I'll help you make a podcast, come to New York, you're not going to say no.
Wow. In this whole time from conception of Science Versus to the time you're getting on the plane to New York, what are we talking about? Like 18 months or something to that effect?
Less.
Wow.
So I think it was, I started making the podcast in mid 2014, and then it was out in August. Like we finished the season in August, and then I was on the plane on the 1st of January.
Wow. That's amazing. That is a tremendous story. And it's admirable because I'm not sure everyone in any line of work would necessarily be able to do the same thing. And I think it's kind of, when you were telling your story about making the decision, I'm thinking to myself, that is the idea that I just don't want to have regrets. If I stay and turn this down, will you be like silently kicking yourself the whole time? Like, oh, I could have, I should have,
Absolutely. I mean, I don't want to say I have a mantra for my life, but I guess I kind of do. And one of them is whether I'm making a little decision like, should I go dancing tonight? Or a big decision like, should I move to New York? I'm always thinking, do I know what will happen if I say no? Do I know what will happen if I say yes? And ultimately, I kind of knew what would happen if I would have said no. I would have kept trying to make my way at the ABC, which, like any public broadcaster, which is sort of tight for cash and this sort of thing, it's very hard to kind of have the resources that you have here. And so you're really trying to push. You're waiting for people to retire before you can move up.
Right.
It's very difficult. And do I know what's going to happen if I say yes? I have no idea. So I got to say yes. Yeah. I think it was definitely, you don't want regrets in this area.
Hey folks, let me jump in just for a quick second and tell you about this week's show sponsor. It is Podbean. They are back again, and I really appreciate their support of the Podcast Digest. So what is Podbean? First time you're hearing about them? It's podcast hosting and monetization, guys. All the tools that you're going to need to start up your own podcast are available through Podbean. They're going to set you up with a blog-like website if you sign up with them. You can customize that website with your preferred themes and colors. A great embeddable player for your show upon release will appear when you publish that episode. You're going to be able to share that episode out to all the socials automatically. If you've got your own website already, no problem. Podbean's got you taken care of. They can integrate their players into your own website. All the RSS and iTunes support you're going to need to be able to import your show or redirect it. Full support for migration if you currently have a show and you're with another host. They've got access to popular applications for both Android and iOS. You'll be part of a new online directory that Podbean features different shows and recommends to their users promotional opportunities as well. The statistics, I've been talking about that for a while, guys. Great comprehensive podcast statistics. If you're a podcaster, you know what I'm talking about. Statistics are where it at. Many of us are stat heads and like to see how our episodes perform. So Podbean can deliver that for you as well. Integrated monetization tools. You can designate episodes as premium content. All right. If you want to participate in advertising, have advertisers on your show. Isn't that a dream of a lot of independent podcasters? They've got a platform set up just for that. Or they've got their own patron program where your listeners can support you directly. All of that and more available through Podbean. In fact, through the end of 2016, they're offering 30% off their annual hosting plan. So if you're listening this week, the week of release on this episode, now's the time to hop over to podbean.com/TPD, and it'll tell you that you came from listening to the Podcast Digest, and you'll get 30% off those annual plans. If you're listening after the first of the year in 2017, then that means that you can still get your first month for free. So check out podbean.com/TPD to learn more. My sincere thank you for Podbean for once again supporting the Podcast Digest. Now, back to my conversation with Wendy. So Science Versus Chapter 2 begins now stateside, and there's a lot of differences now. Those listeners who've been on since the early days hear somewhat of a different thing now. And actually, I wanted to do something, Wendy, if I could with you, that I don't think I've ever done before. Regular listeners of the Podcast Digest will know this, that I actually pre-announced and told a podcast friend of mine that I would be talking to you. Come to find out, she is a super fan of yours, Wendy, and Science Versus. And I said, if you want to ask Wendy a question, send it to me, and I'll be sure to ask her for you. And she was all excited. This is Molly Mendenhall from A Couple Things podcast. You may be familiar with Molly. And she had a question for you. She wanted to know that because Science Versus used to be sort of a much shorter form show in Australia, and now obviously it's a much larger episode by episode event, more in the 40 to 45 minute range, containing a lot more research and editorial content and audio production. She likened it almost to a Radiolab style production at this point. She had two questions for you. How has your preparation and research sort of changed to fit this format? And what has been the best and worst part of moving to a longer show?
Thanks, Molly, for those questions, and thanks, Molly, also for your tweets, which are so sweet and lovely in the dark days of the edits. Those tweets get you along, which tells you a little bit about one of the answers to those questions. In terms of building a longer show, it takes a lot more research. So it's not, I feel like it's almost like an exponential rise in research. It's not just sort of repeating the work that was done in season 1, like doing twice as much research. Sometimes it feels like it's much more than that, because you've just got to develop a story within it. Whereas in season 1, it was very much, say we were looking at the paleo diet, which is episode 1. It was very much you just ask a question, is the paleo diet healthier for you? Answer that in 7 minutes, and then is it better for the environment, or whatever was the other? Is it actually paleo? I think was the question we asked. And then you answer that in 7 minutes, and then you're done, and it's interesting, and it's fun, and it's peppy, and you're out. But when you want to take it to 45 minutes, you can't just keep doing like ask a question, get an answer, ask a question, get an answer, because it gets too repetitive on the ear and it doesn't get as interesting. And so you really have to think about creative ways of telling that science story. So whether it's actually getting out on the field to get hypnotized, which we did for the hypnosis episode, or whether it's going out and actually meeting the scientist who was discussing something like we did with the G-spot, and it takes, and then going out on the field and getting that tape then means you're getting all of this extra tape that you just don't get with a studio two-way interview. So not only are you pulling much more tape, you're also really trying to get outside the bounds of your normal kind of black and white storytelling about science, and you're trying to like really, really break it and be a bit more narratively exciting. And then, even though you're trying to be more narratively exciting, you have to make sure everything is factual. So everyone on or so many of the editors on the Gimlet team have this amazing experience with storytelling, which is something that I just don't have any experience with, because all of my journalism has really just been quite straight science reporting. So we have it's this like lovely tension where they would say, oh, can we say this? Because, and then the scientists did this, and this was their motivation, and this was, because that's when you're telling a story, that's what works. And then we'd constantly be going, no, that wasn't their motivation. No, like, that's not the facts. That's not the facts. Or so you're constantly having this struggle, which was like remarkable but challenging. And so it was very, very different to what was happening in Australia in season 1. So that was, and then kind of on top of that, just by virtue of the Gimlet model, which has an intense edit protocol, so which is something that I had never experienced in Australia working across the field. It is so remarkable. So you write your first script, and then it goes to an edit room where your team plus the editorial, like, so that could be 2 editors or it could be 1 editor, or sometimes it could be 3 editors, are there and they're listening, and then you have these amazing minds all getting in the script and pulling it apart. And then you do it all again, and then you do it all again. And sometimes we would have 4 edits or 5 edits until we got to a point that we thought the story made sense and the science was there. And it was interesting. So in terms of the process of making science versus that has just been flipped on its head in a way that I don't think I fully accepted until towards the end of the season. I kept kind of thinking, oh no, it's just the same. And then I was like, oh no, no. So I think that's been a huge learning curve. And then there was another question in there that was about...
I think you covered them both. The second one was sort of the best and worst part of moving to the longer format.
Yeah, I guess if you for the soundbite though, the best would be pushing. From a personal perspective, it's pushing my radio skills in a way that I just don't think I could have done in Australia. And from the show's perspective, I think it's making it sound much richer and giving people a much bigger story about the science that we're telling. And then the worst part is that you lose some of the spontaneity, I would have to say, when you're seeking perfection and when you're surrounded by some of the best people in the business. You do lose that. Me and Caitlin in the corner just being like, this fart joke's funny, shove it in, let's publish. When you kind of go, Alex Bloomberg, he's given me direct instructions, I can do a fart joke whenever funny, but it just makes it a little bit harder. You got to like question the motivation of the fart joke now.
I could have swore I heard a fart joke this season.
Oh, you would have. You did.
I was going to say, I think there was one.
Yeah. No, I mean, we got to keep our standards up. Yeah, so but it's been a big learning curve, that's for sure.
Oh, just a quick tangent. We're talking about the jokes and things like that. I think for a couple of episodes in the middle of the season, or maybe it was a more constant string. I love your American imitations of pronunciations of particular words. They're easily my favorite.
Do you know how many tweets we got explaining to me how to pronounce Arkansas?
Yeah.
I was like, it was a joke.
Half the state tweeted you, Wendy.
So many people. I was like, it was a joke. I know how to pronounce Arkansas. But then there were lots of also very encouraging stuff. Like, I could understand why you thought that. It does look like Arkansas. Anyway, just for the record, I do know how to pronounce that state.
Well, that's been cleared up. That's good. Somebody out there was wondering when they saw my guest. They're like, "Oh, she's the one who can't pronounce Arkansas."
Understandable, but she still can't.
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned the team now that's involved in a little bit of the process there, and it's no longer sort of you and your shared editor. It is more people. So let's talk about some of those people, how they help, and how you guys all put this together.
Yeah. So the team is amazing, an amazing help. I feel I feel very lucky to have these people. So Heather Rogers is our reporter producer, and she came from print journalism, long form print. She's got a couple of books under her belt, and she's kind of what we call the heart and soul of the team. So she is very much our kind of she finds interesting characters. She knows she kind of recognizes the heart within all of these topics that we're covering. Because it's very easy when you're doing myth-busting or science reporting to get angry at those who don't like science or to make them feel bad about not appreciating science. And it's not particularly helpful. And it's also, it's not good form. I mean, it doesn't change anyone's mind, and everyone's got their opinion for their various reasons. The problem is when they think their opinion is more than opinion, when they think it's fact and when it's not based on fact. And so Heather will always be our reminder in the room of, let's not get too excited, let's not make people feel bad, let's question why it is that they're feeling this. So with our attachment parenting episode, she was the one in the room that was like, there's a reason that parents are following this rule book, because they're anxious about their kids and they want their kids to do the best, and we need to make sure that comes across in the episode. And so she's forever reminding us of that and making sure we don't stand on our science soapbox and just yell. And then Caitlin Sori, as I mentioned, she's the one that we poached from the ABC. She is our senior producer, and so she is kind of across everything. She's organising the music. She's got this ear for music that none of us do. So she's got the most radio experience. She was out on the field with me when we were at the recording the dogs that could sniff out a human body, and it was Caitlin on the mic that was miking up the dog while I was doing the interview. So which meant that we could have this lovely rich audio sound of the dog going which was actually the feeling in the room, but the mics are so directional, so if you just mic the guy that you're interviewing, you kind of miss the panting, which was what we could actually hear. So she was the one who was doing that, and then we could sync up the process. So she's always the one that's thinking about this stuff. And then we also have Shruti Ravindran on our team, and we've had a couple of lovely and really talented interns as well that are just kind of doing some really great research and keeping us on the facts.
It's wildly talented team, and it's clear in each and every one of those episodes, those elements you just highlighted in terms of their contributions. I want to talk a little bit about some of the topics that you've covered, because it appears that you guys are willing or won't shy away from pretty much anything. That you're willing to tackle the biggest, most controversial topics. Is there any worry or fear at all that you may be going down a road that's a little too hot to handle?
Definitely not. Definitely nothing is too hot to handle. I mean, the beauty of our show and what we do is that we're reporting the science. So there was some question with the G-Spot episode, for example, like how far we could go. I'll just cough. So there was a question about how far we could go and what exactly we could talk about. And particularly, I have found that perhaps America is in some ways much more liberal about some topics, but in some ways much more prudish than Australia, or than what I'm used to. But to me, I was always saying we're talking about science. So we can push this as far as the science can go. We can mention the clitoris. We can mention the arms of the clitoris. We can mention where the clitoris goes. We should mention the vagina. We don't shy away. We're not going to use silly language and silly vocab. We are going to talk about the science. And you can do that with everything, with gun control. As I mentioned, we're doing immigration. We can ask those tough questions that people are feeling is true. And we can talk about the science of where that comes from and whether your feelings are true, whether they're not true, or whether science doesn't have an answer. And I feel very lucky to be able to do that, because I think if you're a journalist who is more focusing on character or story, you have to be more careful about various political correctness, because there is some ambiguity there. But when you're just talking about a study, you just got to talk about the study.
It all leads me to this question, Wendy, as well. You mentioned next year immigration's one of the topics, and not to get preview of things still in the shop, so to speak. But we now live in a world, welcome back to a country that now seems to really be struggling with fake news. Regardless of your political disposition on any particular topic, fake news is now apparently a huge problem, and it's all over the place. And that's something, ironically enough, that your show's been tackling for each of its first 2 seasons. And it's sort of the whole premise to pull out the facts. Do you think now what you're doing is even more valuable than maybe even 12 months ago?
I mean, I think the facts and science and explaining to people how science works. Because I sometimes I worry about using the word facts too much, because in our show we do discuss science that is progressing as well, and science as an organ that's always moving. So in some cases we will say conclusion, but then our conclusion is we actually don't know. The good science hasn't been done for us to get an answer on this. And so I worry when I say the word facts, it means science equals the ultimate almighty truth, which is kind of what we joke about in the actual episodes. So I do think that makes people kind of go up on their heads. But still, to answer your question a bit more directly, so I think that knowing how science works and understanding and appreciating and respecting science is always and has always been a good thing. I think in this climate, it is. I mean, in some ways it is more important, but in other ways it has made it harder, because just this feeling in the room is that everyone's got a bias. Everyone's out to get you on every side of it. And so it's made our job a lot harder, because it's made people trusting where we're coming from a lot harder. And we are just coming from the truth. Our team is not a typically liberal, a small L liberal. In Australia, the Liberals are the Conservative Party, which just goes to show what a up in the air kind of system this is. But we're not on the left, we're not on the right, we're not your classic. I think people have these perceptions about who we might be, and it has made it harder for us to just say we're just looking at the science. We really just are. And so I wonder what will come and what this will bring. I keep hearing that we're in a post-truth world. I don't think that's true. I think people's truthiness and their intuitions about the world has always been a powerful player in who they are and what they believe in. I think it is problematic when you have leaders that are also saying these sorts of things. So I think we'll have to wait and see what happens to fact-checking news like ours in the coming year. But it definitely, I won't lie, it has the topics that have come up during the election are definitely on our hit list of questioning what's going on. And it turns out that when we look at a topic as complex as immigration, it's a complicated issue. I'll just say that. And and everyone's got their strong opinions on it. And we're going to be tearing down everyone's, I think.
It's I can't wait to see how you guys operate in this new world, if you will. I mean, in recent weeks, I've seen and read things that just blow my mind between, just climate change. You got Breitbart putting out one article and the Weather Channel replied, just recently. And it's like, this almost seems like the new norm where we're going to be having these combative sides. And what is the, quote, truth or science in this case could get lost. And I think that's a worry of mine. And I think that shows like yours and others, especially investigative journalisms, like Reveal and so many of these others are going to make sure that there is still this narrative of fact or factual information line for most of us that want to figure out what that truth is. So
yeah, I hope so. And I do think that the more, what did you call it, fake news, the more fake news that is around, the more it gets in people's heads and the more they feel justified in their truthiness thinking and their opinion-based thinking. And I think that is a problem. But I hope we do what we can to make people think about the science.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the future, Wendy. You've already alluded to stuff already in the shop for next year with the immigration episode, so on and so forth. So is it safe to say at this point that you guys are in between seasons as we speak?
Yes, it is. So we're very hard at work on season 2, which will come in early March. So we're getting out on the field a little bit more than we did in season 1, and we're trying a couple of different things, so we're pretty excited. And the season is definitely a mix of the heady political battles, and then we've got a couple of just fun ones that I'm very excited to tackle.
So after the first Gimlet season of Science Versus in your first 12-ish months stateside, anything taken away from this season that you maybe want to tweak or try differently in the upcoming season?
I think we just want to do it better. Whatever we're doing, we just want to do it better. So I think because of the change in process and having more edits and having more people and more people's opinions and more people's very clever opinions, it did mean that we were down to the wire a lot of the times when we had to publish something and we didn't have enough time to kind of listen to it that one more time and really make sure that, the joke was landing like we wanted it to, or the music was coming in when we wanted to. So I think we're pretty keen to just let episodes sit a little bit longer and have a better listen to them and just kind of develop where we sit in the space a little more. And I think, but in terms of our science reporting, that was something. While we're definitely, I mean, it's very funny to be part of Gimlet and surrounded by these amazing people who have made radio for so long. Because I definitely think our team has a lot to learn in terms of creating audio. But I think we were really proud of how we presented the science, which is where a lot of our experience comes from. So I think we're definitely going to be keeping on the science and being really hard on ourselves and making sure that we're getting all the facts right and being as fair as possible. But then hopefully as our audio skills develop, we're going to have a little bit more fun there. That'd be nice.
I'm excited for it. I can't wait for it. It's one of my favorite shows, one of my favorite seasons of 2016. And Gimlet must be somewhat of a madhouse in the last half of 2016 here. All these shows, it's a busy place, I imagine.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's been, Matt Lee was saying for a while, we're pregnant. We're heavily pregnant. And now all the babies have popped. Almost. We've got Twice Removed has just popped its trailer. So it's a very exciting place to be. And we're all kind of learning from each other, which is really nice. I mean, I'm listening to Crime Town and I'm thinking, that'd be a nice little trick we could use for Science Versus. And it is a really, and we're all kind of doing very different things, but that we can all learn from each other. So it's a very fun place to be right now. Yeah.
Well, Wendy Zukerman, I want to thank you for taking the time to join me. And if people want to check out Science Versus or any of those other Gimlet shows, can you take just a second, tell them where to find you guys?
Yeah, so we are called Science Versus. That's Science VS. Both seasons are still online. There's the ABC season and the new season at Gimlet Media. We are available everywhere that you can listen to podcasts. So iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play. You can just, if you just go on the Googles or the iTunes, you'll be able to find us, Science VS.
And you guys are on the socials?
We are on the socials. We're a bit bad on Facebook, we're pretty good on Twitter. So you can find us at, I think it's just Science VS as our handle on Twitter, and Science VS Podcast on Facebook.
Yeah, and I will have links to all of those in the show notes, as I always do, folks. Wendy Zukerman from Science Versus, thank you again for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, and Merry Christmas.
And that'll do it for this week's episode, folks. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Wendy Zukerman. A true thrill for me to be able to sit down for a little while and have a conversation with her about Science Versus in her whole journey in this podcasting world. I mean, how many people have literally moved thousands and thousands and thousands of miles to pursue an opportunity and keep their show going? And it was great to hear Wendy's story. So, folks, if you enjoyed this episode, how about an iTunes review? Guys, it takes just a second. Leave a quick review. 5 stars would be wonderful. Or on Google Play or on Stitcher, wherever you listen to podcasts, a quick review would be greatly appreciated. And also, don't forget, if you're a podcaster looking for a new home for your show or want to try something different, or if you're thinking about starting your own show, you owe it to yourself to check out podbean.com/TPD. They're this week's show sponsor. And if you go to that, you'll get 30% off their annual hosting plans through the end of 2016. And if this is 2017 that you're hearing this episode, still check it out because you'll get your first month for free. I really appreciate Podbean's support. And again, if you want to support the show directly, that's on Patreon. There's a link in the show notes. Check them out. I'd really appreciate your support as well. But most importantly, tell a friend about the Podcast Digest. Let's spread this thing all the way around. Podcasting fans need to be listening to the show. I really believe it, because I will take you behind the scenes of your favorite shows and you can get the real story. So another great episode coming up next week, folks. And looking forward to the new year. Got some great things planned. Until next week, my name's Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.